The patrol car screeched to a halt on Serenity Cove's rain-slicked road, tires kicking up gravel as Sheriff Margaret Maggie Hayes gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. A gunshot had echoed through the foggy night moments ago, sharp and close, shattering the coastal town's usual calm. Her radio crackled with static. No backup yet, just her in the dark. She scanned the misty harbor ahead, heart pounding, when a shadow darted across her headlights. A gaunt German shepherd limping, its scarred body collapsing by the rusted gate of Serenity Haven, the old animal shelter. Those amber eyes locked onto hers, piercing through the haze, and Maggie felt a jolt, like a ghost from her past had just clawed its way back. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The clock on the dashboard read 9:47 p.m. Late for a Tuesday in Serenity Cove, Oregon, where the streets usually emptied by dusk. Maggie's shift was supposed to end at 9, leaving her free to sit by her fireplace with a cup of tea and the sound of waves crashing beyond her cottage. But that gunshot, sharp as a snapped bone, had changed everything. She'd been driving home, the fog thick as cotton when the sound ripped through the quiet somewhere near the harbor. Now, here she was parked on the edge of town, staring at a dog that shouldn't be alive. Maggie exhaled slowly, her breath fogging the windshield. She was 68, too old for midnight chases, her knees creaking from years of service, but her instincts still burned bright. The German shepherd hadn't moved since it crumpled by the gate, its thin frame heaving with shallow breaths. Serenity Haven loomed behind it, a squat building with peeling paint and a sagging roof, its windows dark except for a faint flicker in the back, like someone was there, watching. The shelter had always been a sore spot in town, a place folks whispered about, but never fixed up. Maggie's gut churned. That gunshot hadn't come from nowhere. She pushed the car door open, the cold sea air hitting her like a slap. Her boots crunched on wet gravel as she stepped out, the weight of her holster a familiar comfort against her hip. The fog muffled everything. Distant waves, the hum of fishing boats tied up at the docks, leaving only the sound of her own heartbeat and the dog's ragged breathing. Up close, the shepherd was a wreck, ribs jutting under a dull coat, scars crisscrossing its flank like a map of pain. But those eyes, amber, steady, almost human, held her in place. Maggie crouched, ignoring the ache in her joints, and reached for the dog's collar. It was old leather, cracked and faded, the metal tag dulled by time. She rubbed the grime away with her thumb, and the words hit her like a punch. Raven, property of Margaret Hayes. Her breath caught, a sound halfway between a gasp and a sob escaping her lips. Raven. Her Raven. The K-9 partner who'd vanished 3 years ago during a drug bust gone wrong. A night of chaos, gunfire, and blood that still haunted her dreams. "Raven, is it you?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. The dog tilted its head, ears twitching, and its tail gave a faint wag, weak but real. Maggie's chest tightened, memories flooding in unbidden. Raven leaping through smoke to knock a gunman off her, his barks cutting through the roar of that terrible night. She'd searched for weeks after he disappeared, combing the woods beyond town, calling his name until her voice gave out. Eventually she'd let him go, bearing the guilt alongside the grief for her husband Daniel, lost a decade before. But here he was, alive against all odds. Her hands trembled as she ran them over his matted fur, feeling the hard lines of scars beneath. These weren't random marks from a stray's life. too deliberate, too cruel. Slashes along his sides, burns on his paws. Someone had hurt him, and badly. Anger flared in Maggie's gut, hot and sharp, mixing with the relief that threatened to buckle her knees. She glanced back at the shelter, that flicker of light in the window now gone. The gunshot lingered in her mind, a puzzle piece she couldn't yet place. Raven let out a low whine, shifting closer to her, his nose brushing her hand. Maggie's throat burned with unshed tears. "What happened to you, boy?" she murmured, her voice soft but firm, a promise taking root. She'd failed him once, letting him slip away into the dark. Not again. Whoever had done this, whoever had turned her fierce, loyal partner into this broken shadow, would answer for it. She stood wincing as her knees protested and opened the patrol car's back door. "Come on, Raven," she said, patting the seat. He hesitated, his legs shaky, then hauled himself up with a grunt, collapsing onto the worn upholstery. Maggie shut the door gently, her gaze drifting to Serenity Haven one last time. The fog seemed to thicken around it, hiding secrets she could feel in her bones. Sliding behind the wheel, she gripped it tight, her mind racing. Raven's return wasn't a coincidence. Not with those scars, not with that gunshot echoing in the night. Something was wrong in Serenity Cove. Something tied to that shelter and the dog she'd thought she'd lost forever. As she pulled onto the road, the harbor fading into the mist behind her, Maggie made a silent vow. She'd bring Raven home, heal him if she could, and dig until she uncovered the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. Maggie eased the patrol car into the driveway of her seaside cottage, the engine's rumble fading into the steady crash of waves against Serenity Cove's rocky shore. The fog had thickened, curling around the house like a shroud, softening the edges of the weathered clapboard and the single light glowing from the porch. She glanced at Raven in the back seat, through the rearview mirror. His amber eyes glinted faintly, half-lidded with exhaustion, his scarred body curled tight as if guarding what little strength he had left. The sight twisted something deep in her chest, relief warring with a simmering fury she couldn't yet name. She stepped out into the damp night, the salt air sharp in her lungs, and opened the back door. "Come on, boy," she said, her voice low and coaxing, the same tone she'd used years ago when they'd trained together in the pine-scented woods beyond town. Raven lifted his head, ears twitching, then slid off the seat with a stiffness that made Maggie wince. His paws hit the gravel with a soft thud, and he stood there swaying slightly, as if unsure whether to trust the ground beneath him. She knelt beside him, ignoring the ache in her knees, and ran a hand along his side. His ribs pressed against her fingers, stark beneath the dull fur, and those scars, jagged lines and puckered burns, felt like accusations carved into his flesh. Inside, the cottage smelled of cedar and old books, a sanctuary Maggie had built after Daniel's death 10 years ago. She grabbed a faded quilt from the couch, a patchwork thing her mother had sewn decades back, and spread it by the fireplace. The hearth was cold, but she didn't have the energy to light it now. Raven shuffled over and collapsed onto the quilt with a heavy sigh, his eyes drifting shut as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Maggie sat beside him, cross-legged on the hardwood, and watched the rise and fall of his chest. He was alive. Against all odds, he was here. Her mind spun back to that night 3 years ago, the drug bust that had torn him from her. It had been a raid on a fishing shack near the harbor, a tip about meth runners using the docks. She could still hear the shouts, the crack of gunfire, the way Raven's barks had cut through the chaos, as he'd bolted after a suspect. Then an explosion, a propane tank, they'd said later, and he was gone. She'd combed the wreckage, her throat raw from calling his name, but the smoke and flames had swallowed him whole. Or so she'd thought. She'd buried that loss, locked it away with Daniel's memory, telling herself Raven had died a hero. But he hadn't died. He'd suffered. Maggie's fingers brushed a scar on his flank, a deep slash that felt too precise, too intentional. "What did they do to you?" she murmured, her voice trembling. Raven's ears flicked, but he didn't open his eyes. She thought of the gunshot she'd heard tonight, the way it had led her to Serenity Haven. That shelter, its rusted gate, the flicker of light in the window, loomed in her mind like a storm cloud. Raven hadn't wandered there by chance. Someone had left him, broken and discarded, and the thought ignited a slow burn of anger in her gut. The doorbell chimed, a soft trill that jolted her from her thoughts. Maggie stood wincing as her joints protested and peered through the peephole. Clara stood on the porch, her silver hair tucked under a knit cap, a first aid kit dangling from one hand. Maggie opened the door, and Clara bustled in without a word, her sharp blue eyes landing on Raven. "Good Lord, Maggie," she said, her voice thick with shock. "Is that really him?" Maggie nodded, stepping aside as Clara knelt by the quilt. "It's Raven," she said, the words tasting like a confession. Clara, a retired nurse who'd patched up half of Serenity Cove at some point, set the kit down and gently lifted Raven's head. He didn't resist, just watched her with a quiet trust that made Maggie's throat tighten. Clara's hands moved with practiced care, cleaning a raw patch on his paw, her lips pursed as she took in the scars. "He's been through hell," she said finally, glancing up at Maggie. "You see these marks? They're not from scrapping with strays. Someone did this." "I know," Maggie said, her voice hard. She sank onto the couch, the springs creaking under her weight. "Found him by the shelter tonight, right after I heard a shot near the harbor." Clara's eyebrows shot up, but she didn't interrupt, just kept working on Raven. As Maggie recounted the scene, the fog, the dog's collapse, the eerie stillness of Serenity Haven. When she finished, Clara sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on a rag. "You think it's tied to that place?" Clara asked, her tone cautious but curious. She'd lived in Serenity Cove longer than Maggie knew its underbelly, the whispers about missing pets, the way folks avoided the shelter after dusk. Maggie shrugged, but her mind was already turning. "Maybe. He was wearing his old collar, Clara. My name on it. Whoever had him knew who he was." Clara's eyes softened, and she reached over to squeeze Maggie's hand. "He was your shadow after Daniel passed," she said quietly. "Always at your side, keeping you steady. Seeing him like this, it's a miracle, but it's a cruel one." Maggie swallowed hard, the memory of Raven nudging her through those dark days sharp as a blade. Daniel had called him her guardian, a joke that wasn't a joke, and now here he was again, broken but breathing. She looked at Raven, his chest rising slow and steady, and felt a resolve settle over her like a second skin. "Cruel or not, he's back," she said, her voice firming, "and I'm not letting him go again. Whoever hurt him, Clara, they're still out there. I'll find them." Clara nodded, a flicker of pride in her gaze, but there was worry there too, a shadow Maggie couldn't ignore. The room fell quiet save for the distant roar of the ocean and Raven's soft breathing. Maggie's eyes drifted to the window where the fog pressed thick against the glass. She thought of that gunshot, the shelter's locked secrets, and the scars her partner carried. This wasn't just a reunion. It was the start of something bigger, something dark. And as she sat there, the weight of her badge heavy in her mind, she knew the past wasn't done with her yet. Neither was Raven. The sun rose over Serenity Cove, painting the sky a pale gold that shimmered on the restless waves beyond Maggie's cottage. She hadn't slept, her eyes gritty and red from staring at Raven through the night, watching his chest rise and fall as if it might stop if she looked away. He lay on the quilt by the fireplace, a shadow of the dog he'd once been, but alive, stubbornly, impossibly alive. Clara had left hours ago, promising to return with more supplies, leaving Maggie alone with her thoughts and the faint hum of the ocean. The gunshot from last night echoed in her mind, a splinter she couldn't pull free, tied somehow to the shelter where she'd found him. She brewed a pot of coffee, the bitter aroma filling the kitchen, and poured it into a chipped mug Daniel had once loved. Her hand shook slightly, not from age, but from the weight of what she'd seen on Raven's body, scars too deliberate to be accidents, burns that spoke of cruelty she couldn't fathom. She'd spent years policing this town, chasing down petty thieves and drunks, but this felt different, personal, like a wound reopened. At 68, Maggie knew her limits, but she also knew her duty. And Raven's return had lit a fire she couldn't douse. By 8, she was dressed in her uniform, the starched fabric stiff against her skin, her badge a cold weight on her chest. Raven lifted his head as she grabbed her keys, his amber eyes tracking her with a quiet intensity. "Stay here, boy," she said, softening her tone. "Rest up. I'll be back soon." He whined low in his throat, a sound that tugged at her, but he didn't move. She locked the door behind her, the click loud in the morning stillness, and climbed into the patrol car. Serenity Haven was her next stop. She needed answers, and she wasn't leaving without them. The shelter squatted near the harbor, its sagging roof and peeling paint a blight against the crisp coastal air. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp as Maggie parked and stepped out, her boots sinking into the damp gravel. The rusted gate creaked as she pushed it open, the spot where Raven had collapsed still marked by a faint smear of dirt. Inside, the air hit her like a wall, bleach so strong it burned her nose, undercut by something sour, almost chemical. She wrinkled her brow, filing that detail away. The front desk was a cluttered mess of papers and coffee stains, manned by Eddie, a scruffy kid in his 20s with a slouch that screamed indifference. "Morning, Sheriff," Eddie muttered, barely looking up from his phone. His voice was flat, like he'd rehearsed it, and it set Maggie's teeth on edge. She planted both hands on the counter, leaning in until he had no choice but to meet her gaze. "Where'd that German shepherd come from, Eddie?" she asked, her tone clipped, leaving no room for games. "The one I found here last night, thin, scarred up. You know anything about that?" Eddie shrugged, a lazy roll of his shoulders that made her want to shake him. "Found him wandering near the harbor a few months back," he said, eyes darting to the side. "No tags, no chip. That's all I got." His words were too smooth, too rehearsed, and Maggie's gut twisted. She'd dealt with liars before, kids caught with weed, fishermen dodging fines, and Eddie's tells were screaming. The way he wouldn't hold her stare, the faint twitch in his jaw. "That's it?" she pressed, her voice sharpening. "A dog that beat up just shows up and you don't ask questions. Those scars didn't come from the streets, Eddie. Someone did that to him." She watched him closely, catching the flicker of unease that crossed his face before he masked it with another shrug. "Look, I just log 'em in," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Strays come and go. Ain't my job to play detective." Maggie's fingers curled into fists, nails biting her palms. She thought of Raven's burns, the way they'd felt under her hands, deliberate, vicious. And Eddie's apathy stoked the anger she'd been holding back. "You're telling me you didn't notice he'd been hurt," she said, stepping closer, her shadow falling over him. "Not a damn thing struck you as off about a dog that messed up?" Eddie shifted, his chair creaking, and glanced toward a door at the back of the room, a quick, nervous flick of his eyes that Maggie didn't miss. "We get all kinds here," he mumbled, his voice dropping. "Some come in rough. I don't ask where from." But the lie hung heavy in the air, thick as the bleach stench. Maggie straightened, her mind racing. That chemical smell, it wasn't just cleaner. It was sharper, acrid, like something she'd sniffed out in old cases, something tied to the harbor's darker corners. And Eddie's dodge, that glance to the back. There was more here, hidden behind that door, or between these walls. She took a step back, forcing her tone to level out. "Fine," she said, though her eyes stayed hard. "But I'll be talking to whoever runs this place. Eleanor Watts still in charge?" Eddie nodded, reluctant, and she turned toward the exit, pausing at the threshold. "Don't go anywhere, Eddie," she called over her shoulder. "We're not done." He didn't reply, but she felt his stare on her back as she stepped outside, the sea breeze cool against her flushed skin. The harbor stretched out before her, fishing boats bobbing in the gray water, their mast cutting through the fog that still clung to the morning. Maggie stood by the gate, her hand resting on the cold metal where Raven had waited. She replayed Eddie's words, his shifty demeanor and that strange smell. Serenity Haven wasn't just a rundown shelter. It was a piece of something bigger, something that had chewed Raven up and spat him out. She thought of the gunshot again, its echo tying last night to this moment, and a chill ran down her spine. Climbing back into her car, she glanced at the shelter one last time. Eddie was a small fish, but he knew more than he'd let on. She'd bet her badge on it. And Eleanor Watts, the manager, would have answers, whether she liked it or not. Maggie started the engine, her resolve hardening like the cliffs that frame Serenity Cove. Raven deserved justice, and she'd tear this town apart to get it. Whatever secrets the shelter held, they were about to see daylight. And she wouldn't stop until they did. Maggie pulled into her driveway as the midday sun broke through Serenity Cove's stubborn fog, casting long shadows across the cottage's weathered porch. The engine ticked as it cooled, and she sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, her mind churning with Eddie's evasions and that chemical tang lingering in her nose from the shelter. She'd left Serenity Haven with more questions than answers, but the weight of Raven's return anchored her resolve. Whatever had happened to him, it started or ended there, and she wouldn't rest until she knew the truth. She stepped out, the sea breeze tugging at her uniform, and unlocked the front door. Inside, the cottage was quiet, save for the faint creak of the floorboards under her boots. Raven lay on the quilt by the fireplace, his amber eyes opening as she entered. He didn't lift his head, but his tail thumped weakly against the fabric, a small sign of life that made her chest ache. "Hey, boy," she said, her voice softening as she knelt beside him. She set a bowl of water and a plate of leftover chicken from last night's dinner near his nose. He sniffed, then lapped at the water with a slow, deliberate tongue, his movements stiff but determined. Maggie watched him, her fingers tracing the edge of the quilt her mother had stitched decades ago. Bright squares faded to muted tones, a relic of a simpler time. Raven shifted, stretching out a scarred leg, and she reached for his ear. brushing over a jagged mark she hadn't noticed last night. It was old, puckered, a remnant of that chaotic bust 3 years back when he'd vanished. She'd seen it happen, a suspect's knife flashing in the dark, Raven's yelp as he lunged to protect her. The memory hit her like a wave, and she choked on a sob, her hand freezing against his fur. "I should have kept looking for you," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "I gave up too soon." The doorbell rang, sharp and sudden, pulling her back to the present. Maggie wiped her face with her sleeve and stood, peering through the window. Clara stood outside, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder, her silver hair glinting in the sunlight. Maggie opened the door and Clara stepped in, her gaze landing on Raven with a mix of relief and concern. "He's still hanging on," she said, setting the bag down. "Brought some bandages and broth. Thought he could use it." She pulled out a thermos and a roll of gauze, her hands steady from years as a nurse. "Thanks," Maggie said, managing a faint smile as she took the thermos. She poured the warm broth into a shallow dish and slid it toward Raven. He sniffed it, then drank, his tail giving another weak wag. Clara settled onto the couch, watching him with a frown. "He's a fighter," she said. "But those scars—" "Lord, Maggie. They're not right. You get anything out of that shelter?" Maggie sank beside Raven, crossing her legs on the hardwood. "Talk to Eddie, the kid at the desk," she said, her tone hardening. "Claims he found Raven near the harbor months ago. No tags, no story. But he's lying, or hiding something. Kept looking at the back room like it'd bite him." She paused, the chemical smell flashing in her mind. And there was this stench. Bleach, sure, but something else. Sharper. Made me think of the old meth cases down by the docks. Clara's eyes widened, her fingers tightening in the armrest. "You think it's tied to that?" she asked, leaning forward. "The shelter's always been off, Maggie. Years back, folks said animals went missing from there. Dogs, cats, gone without a trace. I remember you looking into it when you first took over as sheriff, but it fizzled out." Maggie nodded slowly, the memory surfacing like a stone rising from the tide. She'd been green then, barely 40, chasing leads that led nowhere, reports dismissed as rumors, files buried under budget cuts. "Maybe it didn't fizzle," she said, her voice low. "Maybe it just went quiet." She thought of the gunshot last night, the flicker of light in the shelter's window and Raven's collar, her name etched on it, a taunt from whoever had held him. "Someone knew he was mine, Clara. They kept him, hurt him, then dumped him where I'd find him. That's no accident." Clara's face softened, but her eyes held a spark of worry. "You're sure you want to dig into this?" she asked. "You're not as young as you were, and Raven, he needs you here, not chasing ghosts." Maggie looked at her friend, then down at Raven, his head resting on the quilt, broth dripping from his muzzle. "He's not a ghost," she said firmly. "He's proof something's wrong, and I owe him more than sitting still." The room grew quiet, the distant crash of waves filling the space. Maggie stood, her knees popping, and moved to the kitchen table where her laptop sat. She opened it, the screen casting a pale glow across her face, and typed Serenity Haven into the search bar. Old articles scrolled up, complaints about neglect, a brief investigation 5 years back that ended in dead ends, whispers of missing animals echoing Clara's story. One line caught her eye. A funding audit that vanished from public record, tied to a name she didn't recognize. Coastal Guardians. She leaned back, the chair creaking under her weight, and glanced at Raven. His eyes were on her now, steady and knowing, like he understood every word she hadn't said. "We're in this together, aren't we?" she murmured, a faint smile tugging at her lips. But the smile faded as she thought of Eddie's nervous glance, that back room, and the secrets festering in Serenity Haven. She'd go back tomorrow, confront Eleanor Watts herself if she had to. Whatever lay behind those scars, it was calling her forward, and Raven, broken as he was, deserved every step she'd take to find it. Maggie woke to the sound of rain tapping against the cottage windows, a soft, relentless rhythm that matched the unease coiling in her chest. She'd barely slept, her dreams tangled with gunfire and Raven's barks fading into smoke. The clock on her nightstand glowed 6:12 a.m., too early for the gray light seeping through the curtains, but she couldn't stay still. She rolled out of bed, joints stiff from the damp, and shuffled to the living room. Raven lay on the quilt, awake now, his amber eyes following her as she moved. The broth Clara had brought sat half-finished by his side, a small victory that steadied her nerves. She brewed coffee, the gurgle of the pot a familiar comfort, and stood by the window watching the rain streak down the glass. Serenity Cove stretched out beyond, its cliffs blurred in the mist, the harbor a shadowy smudge where boats rocked against their moorings. Last night's search on her laptop lingered in her mind. Those articles about Serenity Haven, the missing animals, that buried audit tied to coastal guardians. It wasn't much, but it was a thread, and she'd pulled enough of those in her 30 years as sheriff to know they often led somewhere dark. Raven whined softly, pulling her gaze back to him. His scars stood out in the dim light, slashes and burns that told a story she needed to hear. By 8, she was in her uniform, the starched collar scratching her neck as she grabbed her keys. "Stay put, boy," she told Raven, her voice firm but gentle. He tilted his head, ears twitching, but didn't protest as she locked the door and headed out. The rain had eased to a drizzle, slicking the patrol car's hood as she drove toward Serenity Haven. The shelter loomed ahead, its sagging roof glistening wet, the rusted gate swaying in the wind. She parked and stepped out, the gravel crunching under her boots, her breath fogging in the chilly air. That chemical smell hit her again as she approached, bleach masking something sharper, something that pricked at her memory of old cases. Inside, Eddie wasn't at the desk, replaced by a thin woman in her 50s, with tight lips and a clipboard clutched to her chest. Eleanor Watts, the shelter's manager, looked up as Maggie entered, her face creasing with a forced smile. "Sheriff Hayes," she said, her voice clipped. "Didn't expect you back so soon." Maggie didn't return the smile, her eyes sweeping the room, the cluttered desk, the flickering fluorescent light, that back door Eddie had glanced at yesterday. "I'm here about the dog I found," she said, stepping closer. "German Shepherd, scarred up. You got records on him?" Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening on the clipboard, then turned to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thin folder. She handed it over, her movements stiff, like she'd rather be anywhere else. "That's all we have," she said, avoiding Maggie's gaze. "Found near the harbor, no tags, no chip. Came in a few months back." Maggie opened the file, scanning the sparse notes, vague dates, a scribbled weight, but one line stopped her cold. "Referred by confidential source." She tapped it with a finger, looking up at Eleanor. "What's this mean?" she asked, her tone flat but edged with steel. Eleanor shifted, her smile faltering. "Sometimes people drop animals off and don't want their names tied to it," she said, her voice quieter now. "Happens more than you'd think." Maggie's eyes narrowed. "So, someone brought him here." Someone who knew he was hurt. And you didn't ask who. Eleanor's jaw tightened and she shrugged, a brittle gesture. We're underfunded, Sheriff, overworked. Animals come in rough all the time, strays, runaways. We do what we can with what we've got. Maggie didn't buy it. She thought of Raven's burns, the precision of those scars. Someone hadn't just dumped him. They'd broken him first. He didn't get that way on the streets, she said, stepping closer, her voice dropping. Those marks were deliberate. You're telling me no one here noticed? Eleanor's face paled and she glanced toward the back door, a quick, involuntary flick that mirrored Eddie's yesterday. Before Maggie could press further, a loud thud echoed from behind it, sharp and heavy like something falling or being dropped. Eleanor flinched, her clipboard slipping slightly in her grip. I need to check that, she stammered, already moving toward the door, her steps hurried. Maggie's pulse quickened, her hand brushing the holster at her hip as she watched Eleanor disappear into the shadows beyond. The air shifted, that chemical smell growing stronger, and then a sound faint but unmistakable, a dog's howl, low and mournful, drifting from somewhere deep in the shelter. It wasn't Raven, she knew that much, but it chilled her to the bone, raising the hairs on her arms. She stood there, folder still in hand, the words, confidential source, glaring up at her like a taunt. Eleanor's excuse rang hollow, underfunded or not. This wasn't neglect. It was cover. That thud, that howl, they weren't random. Maggie's mind raced back to the gunshot 2 nights ago, the flicker of light she'd seen in the shelter's window, and Raven's collar with her name etched on it. Someone had wanted her to find him, or had been careless enough to let him slip free. Either way, Serenity Haven was a piece of the puzzle, and Eleanor knew more than she was letting on. The rain picked up outside, drumming against the roof, a steady beat that matched the tension coiling in Maggie's gut. She tucked the folder under her arm, her boots scuffing the linoleum as she turned to leave. Eleanor might have run off, but she wouldn't dodge Maggie for long. That back room, whatever it hid, was her next move, and she'd get in there one way or another. As she stepped into the drizzle, the howl lingered in her ears, a ghost of suffering she couldn't unhear. Raven's scars weren't the end of this. They were a beginning, and whatever lay ahead, it was pulling her deeper into the dark. She'd be back tomorrow, with or without backup, because this wasn't just about her dog anymore. It was about every lost soul crying out from behind those walls. The rain had stopped by evening, leaving Serenity Cove draped in a heavy stillness, the kind that pressed down on Maggie's shoulders as she sat at her kitchen table. The folder from Serenity Haven lay open before her, its sparse notes in that cryptic, referred by confidential source. Staring back like a challenge, Raven rested on the quilt nearby, his breathing steady but shallow, his amber eyes half open as if keeping watch. She'd fed him more broth, watched him lap it up with a quiet determination that mirrored her own. But that howl from the shelter, low, haunting, echoed in her mind, tying her to something she couldn't yet name. She'd spent the afternoon poring over old files on her laptop, cross-referencing the shelter's history with Clara's rumors, and that Coastal Guardian's mention. Nothing solid yet, just whispers of neglect and vanished funds, but her gut told her the pieces were there, waiting to snap together. The gunshot. 2 nights back, Raven's scars, Eleanor's flinch at that thud. It all pointed to the shelter's back room, a shadow she couldn't let sit. By dusk she'd made up her mind. She'd go back tonight, off the clock, and see what Eleanor was hiding. Raven deserved that much, and so did whatever else was trapped in there. Maggie pulled on a dark jacket over her civvies, leaving her uniform behind. Less official, less noise. She grabbed a flashlight and her service pistol, tucking it into her waistband, the cold metal a reassurance against her spine. "Stay here, boy," she told Raven, crouching to stroke his head. He whined, nudging her hand, and she felt a pang of guilt. "I'll be quick," she promised, though the words felt thin. She locked the door and drove to the harbor, parking a block from Serenity Haven to avoid notice. The night was moonless, the fog rolling in thick off the sea, cloaking her steps as she approached. The shelter loomed silent, its windows dark, but a faint hum, like a generator, buzzed from somewhere inside. Maggie slipped around back, her boots soft on the wet grass, and found a side door cracked open, its hinges rusted and loose. She clicked off the flashlight and eased inside, the air hitting her with that familiar mix of bleach and something acrid, sharper now, like acetone or paint thinner. The corridor stretched ahead, dim and cluttered with crates, their edges glinting faintly in the shadows. She moved slow, her breath shallow, every creak of the floorboards loud in her ears. Voices drifted from the end of the hall, low and tense, pulling her closer. She pressed against a stack of crates, peering around the edge. Through a heavy metal door, left ajar, she saw Eleanor. Her thin frame hunched, arguing with a wiry man in a stained shelter uniform. Hank, she guessed from his rough drawl. "We shouldn't have left that dog out front," he hissed, his voice sharp with irritation. "It's bad enough we had to take him in. Now there's a cop sticking her nose where it doesn't belong." Eleanor's hand shook as she clutched a clipboard, her reply trembling. "What was I supposed to do? She came asking questions. I didn't sign up for this." Maggie's pulse quickened, her fingers brushing the pistol grip. Raven. They were talking about Raven. She edged closer, the chemical smell growing stronger, stinging her eyes. Hank's shadow shifted as he leaned in. "You better hope she backs off," he said, "or we're all sunk. That dog's part of something bigger. You know that." Eleanor flinched, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I just wanted to keep this place running. I didn't ask for—" A loud thud cut her off, the same heavy sound Maggie had heard earlier, followed by a muffled yelp from deeper in the building. That was it. Maggie shoved the door open, her badge raised in one hand, flashlight blazing in the other. "Freeze!" she barked, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The room froze, Eleanor's face paling to ash, Hank's twisting into a scowl. The space reeked a mix of filth and chemicals, metal cages lining the walls, most empty but one holding a small, trembling mutt, its ribs stark against its fur. Maggie's stomach churned, but she held steady, pinning them with her glare. "You've got 2 seconds to explain what's going on here," she said, her tone low and lethal. "Who brought Raven in and what's being hidden?" Hank crossed his arms, defiance flickering in his stance, but a tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Don't know what you're talking about," he said, too quick. Eleanor broke first, her clipboard clattering to the floor. "I didn't want any part of this," she stammered, pointing at Hank. "He brought that dog in one night, said to keep it off the records. That's all I know, I swear." Maggie's jaw tightened, her flashlight sweeping to Hank. "Who gave the orders?" she demanded, stepping closer. "What's really going on here?" Hank smirked, a cold edge to it, his fear barely masked. "You're out of your depth, Sheriff. Raven's just one piece of a bigger operation. You think this is about one dog?" Before she could press him, tires screeched outside, a harsh sound that shattered the tension. Maggie spun toward the noise, her beam catching the glint of a black SUV peeling away through the fogged-up windows. Her radio was back in the car. She'd come alone, off duty, and now the choice bit her hard. Hank's smirk widened, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered. "You just made yourself a problem for the wrong people." Maggie's hand moved to her pistol, instinct screaming danger. But the distant rumble of the SUV faded into the night, leaving her with two rattled liars and a room full of questions. Back at home, Raven's howl pierced the quiet, a sudden eerie cry that reached her across the miles, as if he'd felt the shift too. She turned back to Hank and Eleanor, her voice a growl. "Start talking, or I haul you both in right now." But her mind was already racing. Raven's scars, that yelp, the SUV, they were threads in a web she'd just stumbled into. She'd call for backup soon, but first she needed something solid. Whatever Hank meant by bigger operation, it was closing in, and she'd be damned if it caught her, or Raven, off guard again. The shelter's secrets were cracking open, and she was ready to pry them wide. Maggie stood in the dim corridor of Serenity Haven, the flashlight's beam trembling slightly in her grip as Hank's words, "You just made yourself a problem for the wrong people," hung in the air like smoke. The SUV's screeching tires had faded into the fog, but the threat lingered, heavy and real. Eleanor's clipboard lay at her feet, her face a mask of panic, while Hank leaned against a cage, his smirk faltering as the distant wail of Raven's howl reached them through the night. Maggie's heart thudded, that cry pulling her back to the cottage, but she held her ground, pinning them both with a stare that could have cracked stone. "Names!" she snapped, her voice low and sharp. "Who's behind this? Who brought Raven here?" Hank's eyes flicked to Eleanor, then back to Maggie, his defiance crumbling under her glare. "I don't know names," he said, his drawl tightening. "They don't tell me that. I just move what they bring. That dog showed up one night. Orders were to keep it quiet." Eleanor nodded, her hands wringing together. "He's right," she whispered. "They fund us. Keep this place afloat. I didn't ask questions, just took the money." Maggie's stomach twisted, anger flaring hot in her chest. "And you didn't care what they did to him," she said, stepping closer to Eleanor, who flinched. "Those scars, someone tortured him and you let it slide?" Eleanor's eyes welled up, but she didn't answer, her silence a confession. Hank snorted, crossing his arms. "He's different," he said, almost casual. "When they brought him, they said he was special, an asset they didn't want loose. Guess that means you, Sheriff." Her mind raced. Raven, an asset. She thought of his training, his instincts, the way he'd saved her life 3 years back. Someone had taken him, used him, broken him for a purpose she couldn't yet grasp. Before she could dig deeper, headlights swept through the windows, red and blue flashing against the walls. Backup, finally. She'd called it in from her car radio after spotting the SUV, and now patrol cars crunched gravel outside. Hank's smirk vanished, and Eleanor sagged, relief and dread warring on her face. 2 deputies burst in, their hands on their holsters, Jim, a burly veteran, and Lisa, a sharp-eyed rookie. "Sheriff," Jim said, his voice steady. "What's the situation?" Maggie lowered her flashlight, keeping her eyes on Hank and Eleanor. "Caught these 2 talking about my dog, Raven, the one I found here," she said, her tone clipped. "They're tied to something bigger. Illegal activity, animal abuse at least. That SUV that peeled out? Ran the plates on my way back. It's a shell company. No trace. We're taking them in. Jim nodded, motioning Lisa to cuff Hank, who cursed under his breath but didn't resist. Eleanor went limp as Jim secured her wrists, tears streaking her face. "I didn't have a choice," she mumbled. "They'd have shut us down, left all those animals with nowhere to go." Maggie's jaw tightened. "You had a choice," she said, cold and final. "You picked wrong." The deputies led them out, the rain-slicked lot glowing under the patrol lights, and Maggie followed, her boots heavy on the floor. Back at the cottage, she found Raven pacing by the door, his frail body tense, ears pricked as if he'd sensed her absence, and the danger. He stopped when she stepped inside, nudging her hand with a low whine. "I'm okay, boy," she said, kneeling to stroke his head, though her own hands shook. His howl had reached her at the shelter, a connection she couldn't explain but felt in her bones. She locked the door, the click loud in the quiet, and sank onto the couch, Raven settling at her feet. The doorbell rang, soft but insistent, and Maggie tensed, her hand brushing the pistol she'd set on the table. Through the peephole she saw Clara, her silver hair damp from the mist, a paper in her hand. Maggie opened the door and Clara stepped in, her eyes wide. "Heard the sirens," she said, breathless. "You all right?" Maggie nodded, waving her to the couch. "Caught 2 at the shelter," she said. "They're talking, but not enough. Something's off. Raven's part of it, and they're scared." Clara handed her the paper. A letter, creased and yellowed. Daniel's handwriting scrawled across it. "Found this in an old box," she said. "Thought you'd want it now." Maggie unfolded it, her breath catching as she read. "Maggie, Raven's your guardian. Don't let him go." Tears blurred the ink and she clutched it tight, Daniel's voice echoing through the years. "He knew," she whispered, looking at Raven, who watched her with steady eyes. "He always knew." She set the letter down, her resolve hardening. "Eleanor said they're funded by someone. Hank called Raven an asset," she told Clara, her voice firming. "That SUV means they're watching. I need more. Names, places." Clara frowned, worry etching her face. "You're in deep, Maggie," she said. "Deeper than you think." Maggie nodded, feeling the weight of it settle on her shoulders. "Maybe," she said, "but I've got him back. That's worth it." The room grew still, the ocean's roar a distant hum beyond the walls. Maggie glanced at the folders from the shelter, its asterisk, confidential source, asterisk note glaring up at her. Hank's words, "bigger operation," rang in her ears, and that SUV's escape gnawed at her. She'd taken the first step tonight, cracked the surface, but the real fight was coming. Tomorrow she'd push harder. Eleanor might break, and Hank's bravado wouldn't hold forever. She'd call Lillian Brooks, an old detective friend, to dig into coastal guardians. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not for her, not for Raven, and not for whoever thought they could outrun her now. Maggie woke to the gray light of dawn filtering through the cottage curtains, the rain a faint memory in the damp air. She'd slept fitfully, Daniel's letter clutched in her hand until it slipped to the floor sometime in the night. Raven lay curled on the quilt, his scarred body still, but his ears twitched as she stirred. The events at Serenity Haven replayed in her mind. Hank's cryptic warning, Eleanor's trembling confession, that SUV vanishing into the fog. She'd locked them up, but the puzzle was far from solved, and the weight of it pressed against her chest like a stone. She shuffled to the kitchen, the floor cold against her bare feet, and started the coffee pot, its hiss a steady comfort. Raven lifted his head as she returned, his amber eyes meeting hers with a quiet strength that steadied her. "Morning, boy," she said, kneeling to stroke his fur. He nudged her hand, a faint wag of his tail signaling he'd rested. Small progress, but enough to fuel her resolve. She thought of Daniel's words, "Ravens, your guardian," and felt a flicker of him in the room, urging her on. By 9, she was on the phone, pacing the living room as the line rang. Lillian Brooks picked up, her voice a familiar rasp cutting through the static. "Maggie Hayes," Lillian said, a grin audible in her tone. "What's got you dragging me out of retirement?" Maggie didn't waste time, spilling everything. Raven's return, the shelter bust, the shell company plates, and Hank's talk of a bigger operation. Lillian listened, her sharp intake of breath the only interruption. "You've kicked a hornet's nest," she said when Maggie finished. "That Coastal Guardian's name from the audit. It's a non-profit, runs out of the harbor. Flagged for financial oddities years back, but it went cold. I'll dig." Relief washed over Maggie as she hung up, the promise of Lillian's knack for untangling dead ends a lifeline. She trusted her. Lillian had been a bulldog in her detective days, cracking cases Maggie's green years couldn't touch. She glanced at Raven, who'd shifted to watch her. His ears perked. "We're getting somewhere," she told him, her voice firm. But Hank's words, an asset they didn't want loose, gnawed at her. What had they done to him? She needed to see that harbor operation herself, feel it under her boots. By noon she'd fed Raven. More broth, a bit of chicken, and pulled on her jacket, her badge clipped to her belt. "You're with me today," she said, patting her thigh. He struggled to his feet, slow but steady, and followed her to the car, his presence a quiet anchor. She drove to the harbor, the town waking around her, fishermen hauling nets, gulls crying overhead. Coastal Guardian's warehouse sat on the edge, a nondescript slab of concrete and corrugated metal, its windows smudged and dark. She parked a few blocks away, the patrol car tucked behind a stack of crab traps, and stepped out, Raven at her heels. The air smelled of salt and diesel, the harbor alive with the clank of boat rigging and the shouts of dock workers. Maggie moved toward the warehouse, sticking to the shadows of rusted shipping containers, Raven's claws clicking softly on the pavement. Up close, the building looked abandoned, paint peeling, a faded sign barely legible, but a faint glow seeped from a cracked window, and the hum of machinery buzzed beneath the wind. She crouched by a dumpster, peering through the glass. Inside, a shadow passed, a figure moving crates, quick and deliberate. Raven tensed beside her, a low growl rumbling in his throat, his ears flattening. Maggie rested a hand on his back, feeling the tremor in his frame. "Easy," she whispered, though her own pulse quickened. That chemical smell hit her again. Stronger here. Acrid and biting like the shelter, but unmasked by bleach. She thought of the meth lab she'd raided decades back, the way they'd stunk up the woods beyond town. Was that it? Drugs? Animals? Both? Hank's words echoed, part of something bigger, and she felt the threads tightening, pulling her closer. She edged along the wall, Raven shadowing her, his limp less pronounced now, as if the hunt sharpened him. A side door stood ajar, rusted hinges creaking in the breeze. She nudged it open with her boot, peering into a dim room stacked with crates, wooden, unmarked, some cracked open, to reveal glints of metal she couldn't place. The hum grew louder, a generator maybe, and voices murmured from deeper inside, too faint to catch. Raven's growl deepened, his hackles rising, and Maggie's hand brushed her pistol, instincts flaring. This wasn't a nonprofit. This was a front. She slipped inside, the concrete floor cold underfoot, Raven pressing close. The chemical stink was overpowering now, stinging her eyes, and she spotted a cage in the corner, empty, but stained with something dark. Her stomach churned, images of Raven's scars flashing in her mind. Whatever they'd done to him, it had roots here, in this shadowed maze by the sea. She moved toward the voices, crouching behind a crate, when a shadow loomed ahead. A man, broad-shouldered, pausing as if he'd heard her. Raven's growl cut off, his body going still, and Maggie held her breath, the flashlight in her pocket unlit but ready. The man turned away, disappearing around a corner, and she exhaled, her grip tightening on Raven's collar. "We're close," she murmured, her voice a thread in the dark. She'd seen enough, crates, cages, that smell, to know Lillian's dig would hit pay dirt. This was the next step, a lead to chase, but she couldn't push further alone, not yet. She'd call Lillian again, get her to the station and plan the raid. Whatever coastal guardians hid, it was watching her now, and she'd be ready when it blinked. Maggie lingered in the dim warehouse, the chemical stench clawing at her throat as she crouched behind a crate, Raven pressed tight against her side. The hum of machinery vibrated through the concrete floor, and the voices she'd heard moments ago faded into a tense silence. She'd seen enough. Crates, an empty cage, that acrid smell tying this place to Raven's scars. But she couldn't leave without something concrete. Her fingers brushed the flashlight in her pocket, itching to illuminate the shadows, but she held back, knowing light could betray her. Raven's ears flicked, his low growl a steady pulse beneath her hand, urging her forward. She edged deeper, the crates towering around her like a maze, their splintered wood catching on her jacket. Raven moved with her, his limp less pronounced now, as if the danger sharpened his old instincts. She spotted a smaller cage ahead, tucked against the wall, its door ajar. Inside, a scrawny mutt trembled, its ribs stark against matted fur, eyes wide with fear. Maggie's breath caught, another victim, like Raven, trapped in this hellhole. She pulled a pocket knife from her belt, its blade glinting faintly, and knelt by the cage, whispering, "It's okay, little one. You're safe now." The latch gave with a soft snap, and the dog shrank back, a whimper escaping its throat. Maggie reached in, her touch gentle, coaxing it out, when footsteps echoed behind her, heavy, deliberate. She spun, knife still in hand, and faced a man looming in the shadows, a crowbar dangling from his grip. His face was hard, unshaven, his eyes cold as he sneered, "You shouldn't be here, lady." Maggie stood slow and steady, pocketing the knife as her other hand hovered near her pistol. Raven stepped forward, his growl rising, a deep rumble that filled the space. "You've got two choices," Maggie said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Walk away, or I bring this whole operation down right now." The man held his ground, his smirk fading as Raven's teeth bared, his scarred body coiled like a spring. "Don't know what you've gotten into," he said, his tone steady but his eyes darting, betraying nerves. "Dogs like that one." He nodded at Raven. "Don't end up here by chance. Who's behind this? What's the connection?" Maggie pressed, stepping closer, her gaze locked on his. Before he could answer, headlights blazed through the warehouse windows, bright and blinding, cutting through the fog outside. The rumble of an engine idled close, too close, and the front door burst open with a crash. 3 men stormed in, dark figures against the glare, weapons drawn but not yet raised. Maggie's heart slammed against her ribs, her hand snapping to her pistol as she pivoted, Raven barking sharp and loud, the sound bouncing off the walls. "You should 'a' walked away, cop," the leader said, his voice ablade, his face shadowed under a hood. "This ain't your fight." "It is now," Maggie shot back, drawing her gun and aiming square at his chest. "Fire those, and you'll have the whole precinct here in minutes. That what you want?" Her words hung heavy, the distant wail of sirens already threading through the night. Backup, she'd called after leaving the shelter, finally closing in. The leader laughed, a cold, hollow sound, and gestured to the crowbar man. "Get out," he snapped, but Raven lunged, barking fierce enough to rattle the crates, his sudden move startling them all. In that split second, Maggie held her aim steady, her finger light on the trigger. "Enough," she shouted, her voice booming. "Drop the weapons and leave, or this ends here." The sirens grew louder, tires crunching gravel outside, and the leader cursed, his bravado cracking. "This isn't over," he hissed, backing toward the door, his men following, their guns lowering as they retreated. Raven stood firm, his growl a warning that lingered as they slipped into the fog, the SUV's engine roaring to life and fading fast. Maggie exhaled, her arm trembling as she holstered her pistol, the adrenaline draining slow. The mutt whimpered behind her, still huddled in the cage, and she turned, kneeling to scoop it up. It shivered in her arms, small and frail, a mirror to Raven's own suffering. "We'll get you out," she murmured, her voice soft but fierce. Raven nudged her leg, his amber eyes locked on hers. A silent pack renewed in the chaos. She glanced around. The crates, some cracked open, revealed metal canisters and plastic bags, hints of drugs or worse, evidence, scattered but real. The warehouse door banged open again, this time with Jim and Lisa, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. "Sheriff!" Jim called, his voice tight with relief. Maggie stood, the mutt cradled against her chest, Raven at her side. "Caught him in the act," she said, nodding to the crates. "Armed men, just fled, SUV again. Secure this place, get forensics in. There's more here than we thought." Lisa took the dog, her face softening while Jim radioed for more units, his eyes scanning the mess. Maggie stepped outside, the fog cool against her flushed skin. Raven sticking close. The sirens faded to a hum, the night settling back into its uneasy quiet. She replayed the leader's words, "This isn't over," and felt the weight of Daniel's letter in her pocket, his voice steadying her. "Raven won't ever leave you." She'd faced them down, her guardian at her side, and lived. But it was just the edge of it. Coastal guardians, the shelter, Raven's scars. They were a web, and she'd only snagged a thread. She climbed into the patrol car, Raven settling in the back, his breathing ragged but strong. Jim would handle the scene, but she needed Lillian now. Those canisters, that operation, they'd crack it wide open. Tomorrow she'd push harder, dig deeper, because whoever they were, they'd made a mistake tonight. They'd shown their hand, and Maggie wasn't backing off. Not with Raven beside her, not with that mutt's fear burned into her memory. The fight was hers now, and she'd see it through, no matter what came next. Maggie sat on her cottage couch, the morning light streaming through the windows, casting soft bars across the hardwood floor. Raven lay at her feet, his scarred head resting on her boots, his breathing steady but shallow after last night's chaos at the warehouse. The mutt she'd rescued, a scrappy little thing with matted fur, curled up on the quilt by the fireplace, its eyes darting nervously but calming under the warmth. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying the standoff. The armed men, the crates, Raven's fierce bark cutting through the tension. The precinct had the scene locked down now, forensics combing through the evidence, but the weight of it all pressed against her ribs. She sipped coffee from Daniel's old mug, the bitterness grounding her as she stared at the folder from Serenity Haven, its confidential source. Note a taunt she couldn't shake. Jim had called it dawn. Canisters of chemicals, traces of narcotics, shipping manifest with coded destinations. Coastal Guardians wasn't just a front, it was a machine, and Raven had been caught in its gears. She ran a hand over his head, feeling the rough lines of his scars, slashes, burns, marks of a cruelty she'd only begun to unravel. "What did they do to you, boy?" she murmured, her voice thick with a grief she hadn't let loose. The doorbell chimed, and Maggie stood, her knees creaking as she crossed to the door. Clara stepped in, her silver hair pulled back, a thermos of broth in one hand and worry etched deep in her face. "Heard about the warehouse," she said, setting the thermos down. "You all right?" Maggie nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured broth for Raven in the mutt. "Got out alive," she said, her tone flat but firm. "Found another one, same shape as him." "They're tied to something big, Clara. Drugs, maybe worse." Clara sank onto the couch, watching Raven lap at the broth with slow, deliberate licks. "He's tougher than he looks," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "But you're in over your head, Maggie. Those men, they meant business." Maggie sat beside her, Raven shifting to rest his muzzle on her knee. "They did," she agreed, "but they ran. Sirens scared 'em off. Means they're not untouchable." Clara's eyes softened, but the worry didn't fade. "You've got proof now," she said. "What's next?" Maggie leaned back, the springs creaking under her weight. "Lillian's digging into Coastal Guardians," she said. "Jim's got the evidence logged, enough to bury Hank and Eleanor, maybe more, but I need the why. Why Raven? Why here?" She paused, her gaze drifting to him, his amber eyes meeting hers with a trust that cut deep. "Hank said he was an asset. Special. I think they took him that night, trained him for something, broke him when he wouldn't bend." Clara's breath hitched, her hand reaching for Maggie's. "Trained him?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "For what?" Maggie shook her head, the pieces still jagged in her mind. "Don't know yet," she said, "but he got away. Found his way back to me. That's what matters." She thought of the warehouse, the mutt sphere, the canisters, hints of a network stretching beyond Serenity Cove, dark and sprawling. Raven's escape had cracked it open, and she'd keep prying until it shattered. The phone rang, shrill against the quiet, and Maggie grabbed it, her pulse quickening. Lillian's voice crackled through, sharp and urgent. "Got something," she said. "Coastal Guardians, they're a shell, all right, but the harbor ties to a trafficking ring. Dogs, drugs, the works. Your Raven? Records show a K9 went missing 3 years back. Same bust you mentioned. Turned up in a black market deal. Trained for guard work, sold high. He must have bolted, ended up at the shelter when they couldn't break him." Maggie's grip tightened on the receiver, her chest burning as Lillian's words sank in. "Sold him," she repeated, her voice a growl. "They stole him, hurt him, then dumped him when he fought back." Lillian sighed, heavy and tired. "Looks that way. Warehouse evidence backs it. Chemicals for doping, crates for transport. You've got him on the ropes, Maggie, but the head's still out there. Keep pushing." She hung up, leaving Maggie staring at Raven. The truth. A knife twisting in her gut. She set the phone down, her hands shaking as she knelt beside him, tracing his scars with trembling fingers. "You never gave up," she whispered, tears spilling hot down her cheeks. "They tried to break you, and you came home." Raven leaned into her, his nose brushing her palm, a quiet strength flowing between them. Clara watched, tears in her own eyes, and reached for the thermos. "Tell me his story," she said softly. "All of it. I want to hear." Maggie sat back, wiping her face, and began. Raven's leap through gunfire, his disappearance, the years she'd mourned him. Her voice broke as she spoke of his scars, the warehouse, the mutt, proof of a fight he'd won against odds she couldn't fathom. Clara listened, her hands clasped tight, and when Maggie finished, she squeezed her shoulder. "He's a miracle," Clara said, "and so are you. Don't let them take that." The room settled into a hush, the ocean's roar a distant pulse beyond the walls. Maggie looked at Raven, then the mutt, their survival a fire in her blood. Lillian's call had given her the why, trafficking, profit, pain, but the who still lurked, shadowy and close. The warehouse bust had rattled them, and that leader's threat, "This isn't over," hung like a storm on the horizon. She'd take this to the station, push Eleanor and Hank harder, lean on Lillian's leads. Tomorrow she'd rally the town. Clara could help, spread the word, because this wasn't just her fight anymore. It was Serenity Cove's, and she'd see justice done. For Raven and every soul they'd tried to break. Maggie stood in the station's interrogation room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting harsh shadows across the metal table where Eleanor Watts sat. Her thin hands fidgeted with the paper cup, her eyes red-rimmed and darting, as Maggie leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Hank slouched in a separate room down the hall, his bravado muted under Jim's steady glare. But Eleanor had cracked first, her voice trembling as she spilled what she knew. It was mid-afternoon, 2 days after the warehouse raid, and Serenity Cove buzzed with the fallout, arrests piling up. Serenity Haven shuddered, its animals moved to a county rescue. Raven waited at home with the mutt, their presence a quiet fuel for Maggie's fire. "You've got one shot to make this easier," Maggie said, her tone cold but even, her badge glinting on her chest. "Names, Eleanor. Who funded you? Who brought Raven in?" Eleanor swallowed, her cup crumpling slightly. "I don't know all of it," she said, her voice small. "They called themselves Coastal Guardians, sent money through back channels, kept us running. Hank dealt with them more. He'd bring in dogs sometimes, ones they didn't want tracked. Raven came one night, half dead, and they said to keep him off the books." Maggie's jaw tightened, Lillian's call echoing in her mind. Trafficking, black market deals, Raven sold and broken. "And you didn't ask why?" she pressed, stepping closer. Eleanor's tears spilled over, her shoulders shaking. "I couldn't," she said. "We'd have lost everything, the shelter, the animals. They threatened to pull it all if I talked. I thought it was just cash at first. Then the dogs started coming, and I knew it was wrong, but I was in too deep." Maggie's stomach churned, pity warring with disgust, but she held firm. "You're out now," she said. "Give me something solid. Locations, contacts, or you're as guilty as they are." Eleanor nodded, wiping her face, and scribbled a list. Drop points near the harbor, a burner number she'd called once. Names Hank had let slip. Carl, Denny, shadows in the web. Maggie took it, her pulse quickening. Leads finally, threads to pull. She left Eleanor with Lisa to process, then checked on Hank. He'd clammed up, his smirk gone, but Jim had squeezed out a confirmation. Coastal guardians ran dogs and drugs, a pipeline stretching beyond Oregon. The warehouse evidence, chemicals, manifests, tied it tight, and arrest rolled in. The crowbar man, low-level runners, pieces of the machine crumbling under pressure. By evening, Maggie drove home, the sun dipping low, painting the cliffs gold against the gray sea. Raven greeted her at the door, his tail wagging slow but sure, the mutt peering from the quilt with cautious eyes. She knelt, stroking Raven's head, his scars rough under her fingers. "We're getting there," she murmured, feeling the weight lift slightly. The station was a hive, feds called in, coastal guardians' shell cracking. But the head, the one who'd hissed, "This isn't over," stayed elusive, a ghost she'd chased down yet. Clara arrived an hour later, her arms full of flyers, her face alight with purpose. "Town's buzzing," she said, setting them on the table, crudely printed sheets announcing a gathering at the community hall. "Folks want to help, raise funds for the rescues, get the word out. You stirred something, Maggie." She smiled, but her eyes held a question. "You sure you're up for this?" Maggie glanced at Raven, then the mutt, their survival a quiet roar in her blood. "Damn sure," she said, her voice firm. "They tried to break him. Break all of them. We're not letting that stand." The next morning the hall was packed. Fishermen in worn jackets, retirees with knitted scarves, kids clutching jars of change. Clara stood at the front, her voice steady as she told Raven's story, his leap through gunfire, his scars, his return. Maggie sat near the back, Raven at her side, his head high despite his frailty, the mutt cradled in Lisa's lap nearby. Whispers rippled through the crowd, shock, anger, pride. And when Clara called for donations, hands shot up, coins clinking into buckets, a tide of support swelling around them. Maggie's throat tightened. Daniel's words, "Don't let him go," echoing as she watched Serenity Cove rise. By noon they'd raised enough to house the rescued animals, dozens pulled from the shelter and warehouse, thin but alive. Clara hugged her, tears in her eyes. "You did this?" she said, but Maggie shook her head. "He did," she replied, nodding to Raven. "And you." The mutt yipped, a small sound that drew laughs, easing the weight in the room. But as the crowd thinned, an envelope slipped under Maggie's hand, plain, unmarked, scrawled with a single line. "Thank you. From one they hurt." She froze, her pulse spiking, a victim maybe, or a witness, silent but watching. She drove home, Raven in the back, the mutt on the seat beside her, the envelope burning a hole in her pocket. The station had called. Hank named Carl as the SUV leader, a mid-tier thug, but the top stayed hidden, a shadow slipping through the cracks. Maggie parked, the ocean's roar filling the silence, and sat on the porch with Raven, the mutt nestled close. She opened the letter again, its words a spark. Someone else knew, someone tied to this fight. Tomorrow she'd push Lillian harder, rally the town again, because this wasn't done. The head was out there, and that threat lingered, a storm she'd face with Raven and Serenity Cove behind her, stronger than ever. Maggie stood on the windswept beach of Serenity Cove, the autumn sun dipping low, casting a warm glow over the waves that rolled in steady and slow. Raven sat beside her, his scarred body bathed in gold, his amber eyes fixed on the horizon. The mutt, now named Daisy by Clara's insistence, scampered at the water's edge, chasing gulls with a tentative joy that hadn't been there a week ago. It was a crisp October morning, 3 weeks since the warehouse raid, and the town hummed with a quiet triumph behind them, Serenity Haven gone, coastal guardians network unraveling, dozens of animals safe in new homes. Maggie's boots sank into the sand, her hands in her jacket pockets, Daniel's letter a soft weight against her heart. The feds had swept in after the community hall push, Eleanor's list and Hank's grudging confessions cracking the case wide. Carl, the SUV leader, was nabbed in a Portland sting, his snarling threats silenced by cuffs in a cell. The top dog, a faceless broker Lillian traced to Seattle, slipped the net, vanishing with the last threads of Coastal Guardian's funds, but Maggie didn't care much. The machine was broken, its pieces scattered, and Serenity Cove had won back its soul. Arrests piled up, 15 in all, from runners to handlers, and the warehouse evidence sealed their fates. Drugs, trafficking, cruelty laid bare in court dockets. She glanced at Raven, his tail wagging gently as the breeze ruffled his fur. Lillian's call yesterday had filled in the final gaps. Raven stolen that night 3 years back, sold to a ring that trained dogs for guard work, doped and beaten until he'd snapped free, trekking miles to find her. His scars were a map of that hell, but his eyes held a peace now, a trust rebuilt in the quiet days since. "You're a fighter," she murmured, kneeling to stroke his head. He leaned into her, nose brushing her palm, and she felt Daniel there too. "Your guardian." A bond time couldn't sever. Clara's fundraiser had bloomed beyond the hall, the town pooling cash and care until every rescued animal had a place. Daisy with Clara, others with families who'd wept at their stories. The anonymous note, "Thank you," from one they hurt, sat framed on Maggie's mantel, a mystery unsolved, but a gift all the same. She'd shown it to Lillian, who'd grunted, "Some survivor, probably." "You gave 'em hope." Maggie liked that. Hope. A thread tying her to Raven, to Daisy, to Serenity Cove itself. Footsteps crunched behind her, and she turned to see Clara approaching, her silver hair glinting, a scarf flapping in the wind. "Thought I'd find you here," Clara said, her smile warm as she joined them. Daisy yipped, bounding over to nuzzle Clara's legs, and Raven's ears perked, his tail thumping harder. "Town's still talking," Clara went on, nodding back toward the cliffs where houses glowed with late fall light. "They're calling you to the heart of it. Sheriff and her shadow taking down the bad guys." Maggie chuckled, a rare sound that softened her weathered face. "Wasn't just us," she said, her gaze drifting to Daisy, then Raven. "Took all of us. You, Lillian, Jim, the whole damn cove." Clara squeezed her arm, her eyes bright. "Maybe," she said, "but you started it." "Raven came home and you didn't stop till it was right." Maggie looked away, the sea blurring as tears pricked her eyes. She'd fought for him, for them all, and won, more than she'd dared hope that first foggy night. They walked along the shore, the sand cool and firm, Daisy darting ahead while Raven kept pace with Maggie's slower stride. His limp was still there, his body weaker than before, but he moved with a purpose that matched her own. She stopped near a driftwood log, its gnarled shape smoothed by tides, and sat, Raven settling beside her, his warmth a steady comfort. Clara joined them, Daisy flopping at her feet, and for a moment they just listened. The waves, the gulls, the town breathing beyond the dunes. "We're home, old friend," Maggie whispered, her hand resting on Raven's head, his fur coarse but alive under her touch. He looked up, eyes locking with hers, and she saw it. Peace, hard-earned and whole. Clara smiled, tears glinting on her cheeks. "You both are," she said, her voice soft. "And we're better for it." Maggie nodded, the weight of the past weeks lifting like mist burned off by the sun. The fight was done, the scars theirs to carry. But they'd healed something bigger. Each other. The town, a future reclaimed. Behind them, voices drifted down. Townsfolk gathering near the pier, lanterns flickering as dusk crept in, a quiet celebration of what they'd saved. Maggie stood, brushing sand from her jeans, and Raven rose with her, Daisy scampering ahead with Clara. They joined the crowd, hands clapping Maggie's shoulder, eyes shining with gratitude. She didn't speak, just stood with Raven at her side, the sea stretching vast and calm before them. The horizon glowed, a promise of days to come, and as the first stars pierced the sky, Maggie felt it, closure, fierce and final, a story ended, where it began, by the water's edge, with her guardian home. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.